The house had once been filled with life. Laughter and voices had echoed through its walls, and the scent of home-cooked meals lingered in the air. Now it stood quiet and empty, a mausoleum of memories that had long faded. Michael sat in the same worn armchair he'd been using for years, the leather cracked from use. The room was neatly arranged, but lifeless. Photographs on the mantel, books neatly aligned on the shelf, and a small vase of dried flowers in the corner, remnants of a world that no longer existed. Michael's life, in many ways, had ended 5 years ago. It had ended when Elena, his wife of 35 years, had taken her last breath. Since then, he had merely existed, drifting through his days with no direction, no purpose. He filled his time with menial tasks, mowing the lawn, organizing tools in the garage, watching the same news programs every night. He ate simple meals at the same time every day, took the same evening walk around the block, and then returned to the empty silence that awaited him. Elena had been his anchor, his love, his life. They had shared so much, joys, sorrows, dreams. Losing her had torn a hole in his soul that he no longer believed could ever be mended. The first year after her death had been a fog. He had barely left the house, speaking only when necessary, just enough to assure those around him that he wasn't completely lost. Yet he was. He was completely and utterly lost. In the years that followed, Michael had adjusted to the void, not because the pain had lessened, but because he had simply grown accustomed to it. Grief was his new companion. He wore it like a familiar coat, always with him, never too far from his thoughts. One item, though, tied him most directly to Elena. It was a small, intricately designed pocket watch she had given him a few weeks before she passed. He remembered the moment vividly, the tremor in her hands as she had wrapped her thin fingers around his and placed it in his palm. Her eyes, still so full of love despite the cancer that had ravaged her body, had glistened with unshed tears. "For you," she had whispered, "to remind you that I'm always with you." The watch wasn't new or expensive. It was old, worn around the edges, and had belonged to Elena's grandfather, a keepsake from generations past. But to Michael, it was priceless. The moment he had first held it, he had felt the weight of their shared years settle in his chest. Their mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, their afternoons hiking through the woods, and their nights falling asleep beside each other. Her warmth a comfort he could never describe in words. For the first 2 years after Elena's death, the pocket watch had rarely left his hand. He would hold it at night, run his fingers over its surface, press its worn button to hear the soft ticking inside. It was a lifeline to Elena, a piece of her that he could still touch, even if he could no longer hold her. But over time, the watch had begun to feel different. What had once been a source of comfort began to weigh on him. The ticking that had brought him peace now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. Each tick seemed to echo the passage of time, the endless stretch of days without her. It became harder to look at, harder to hold. Instead of feeling Elena's presence through it, he felt the stark absence of her. It was as though the watch, once a symbol of their love, had transformed into a reminder of her death. Michael began to wonder if it was time to let go. Was it wrong to hold on to this piece of her when it only brought him pain? Could releasing the watch help him release some of his grief? He wasn't sure, but the thought stayed with him. Night after night, he would stare at the watch resting on his bedside table, its silver surface catching the light, and wonder if maybe it was time to let go of the past, time to free himself from the memories that had become shackles. One rainy afternoon, after days of agonizing over the decision, Michael found himself standing by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The pocket watch was in his hand, as it often was when he was deep in thought. He turned it over, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers, and tried to remember the last time it had brought him comfort. Months had passed, maybe even a year, since it had felt like a blessing. Now it was only a burden. "Elena, what should I do?" he whispered into the stillness of the house. His voice was rough from disuse, and the silence that followed felt oppressive. He had never been one for signs or omens, but as the rain fell harder outside, Michael felt something stir within him, a quiet voice urging him toward a decision he had been avoiding. He walked to his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box. Gently, he placed the pocket watch inside and closed the lid. The act felt final, like sealing away a part of his life he wasn't sure he could ever reclaim. Yet, there was a strange sense of relief in it too, as though he had made the first step toward something new. Something unknown, but perhaps necessary. For the first time in years, Michael considered what it might mean to move on, to live without being tied so completely to the past. He knew he couldn't forget Elena. Didn't want to, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to live without the constant ache that had defined him since she'd gone. The idea felt foreign, almost wrong, but it was there, hovering at the edges of his thoughts. In the quiet of the room, Michael exhaled, long and slow, and sat back down in his chair. He would wait a little longer before making any decisions, but the seed had been planted. The watch, once a symbol of his greatest love, might need to find a new purpose, just as he needed to find his own. Michael wasn't ready to let go of Alina, not entirely, but maybe letting go of the watch was the first step toward freeing himself from the prison of his grief. Little did he know, the decision to part with that watch would set off a chain of events that would forever alter the course of his life. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind that passed without distinction. The air was crisp, with autumn leaves drifting lazily from the trees and crunching underfoot. Michael, as was his routine, made his way to the local grocery store, a small establishment on the edge of town. It was a modest place, owned by a family who had known him and Elena for years, though the shop's new generation now greeted him with little more than polite smiles and nods. He rarely spoke much anymore, his visits an exercise in silence. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, collecting items that held little interest. Bread, milk, a few vegetables he might let spoil before finding the motivation to cook them. As he approached the checkout counter, Michael's eyes caught something unusual. A young man stood by the entrance, fidgeting with his hands, his eyes darting nervously across the room. His clothes were unkempt, his hair disheveled, and there was a heavy air of desperation about him. Michael felt a flicker of recognition, not because he knew the young man, but because that look, the one that spoke of loss, of broken dreams, was something he had seen in his own reflection too many times. The young man, Lucas, as Michael would soon learn, seemed out of place in this quiet town, as though he were a fragment of a different world altogether. Something about him stirred a feeling in Michael that had long been dormant, a feeling of empathy, a quiet understanding of the weight this stranger was carrying. Lucas caught Michael's gaze and quickly looked away, but something compelled Michael to approach him. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the lonely ache that had settled into his bones over the years, the desire to break the silence that had become his constant companion. Or maybe, on some level, he sensed that Lucas needed someone to notice him, to acknowledge that he existed. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, his voice gruff from disuse but carrying a note of concern. Lucas blinked, as though surprised that someone had spoken to him. For a moment, he didn't answer, just stared at Michael with a mixture of apprehension and relief. Finally, he nodded, though the gesture lacked conviction. "Yeah, I'm fine," Lucas mumbled, his voice low and hoarse. But his eyes betrayed him. There was nothing fine about the emptiness reflected there. Michael didn't press further. He had no right to pry into this stranger's life, but something about Lucas's demeanor nagged at him. He could see the same quiet desperation in Lucas that he had felt himself after Elena's death, a need to hold on, but with nothing left to grasp. "Sometimes," Michael began slowly, "we all need someone to talk to." Lucas hesitated, but then something in him seemed to break. He let out a long breath and nodded again, this time more genuinely. "I guess you're right," he said softly, though his words hung in the air with a weight that suggested there was much he wasn't saying. They stood there awkwardly for a few moments. Michael didn't know what had possessed him to start this conversation, but now that it had begun, he didn't want to walk away just yet. It was as though some invisible force was pulling him toward Lucas, urging him to listen. "I've been going through some stuff," Lucas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things haven't been going well. Lost my job, lost my place to live, and, well, everything feels like it's falling apart." Michael listened in silence, nodding occasionally, but offering no empty platitudes. Lucas didn't need hollow words or sympathy. He needed understanding, and Michael understood more than he wished to admit. Lucas continued, explaining how his relationships had crumbled, how his dreams of building a career, a life, had all but vanished. The details were different, but the core of his pain was familiar. Michael heard echoes of his own loss in the young man's story. Lucas was living the same emotional isolation that Michael had been trapped in for years. As Lucas spoke, Michael's hand unconsciously drifted to his pocket, where he could feel the shape of the wooden box that held Elena's watch. The weight of it pressed against his side, a constant reminder of the past that he couldn't seem to escape. But as he listened to Lucas, something shifted within him. The watch had always been a symbol of his grief, but in that moment, he wondered if it could be something more. A symbol of hope, of connection, even if it wasn't his own. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Michael pulled the wooden box from his pocket and held it out to Lucas. "Here," he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. "I want you to have this." Lucas looked at the box, confusion flickering across his face. He didn't reach for it at first, clearly unsure why this stranger was offering him something so personal. "What is it?" Lucas asked, his brow furrowing. Michael swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the box for just a moment before he loosened it, forcing himself to let go. "It's a watch," he explained. It meant a lot to someone I loved very much. She gave it to me, but I think maybe it's time for me to pass it on." Lucas shook his head, taking a step back. "I can't accept something like that," he said, his voice shaky. "It sounds important to you." "It is," Michael admitted, his heart pounding in his chest. "But I think you need it more than I do now." For a moment, they both stood in silence, the weight of the offer hanging between them. Michael could feel his chest tightening, the familiar ache of grief rising up as he extended the box toward Lucas again. His hand trembled slightly, but he held it steady. "I don't know why," Michael said quietly, "but I feel like this might help you. Maybe it'll remind you that things can get better." Lucas hesitated, his gaze shifting between the box and Michael's face. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the box from Michael's hand. His fingers brushed against the worn wood, and he opened the lid carefully. Inside, the pocket watch gleamed softly, its surface catching the light from the store's overhead lamps. Lucas stared at it for a long time before finally looking back up at Michael, his eyes filled with something like gratitude, though it was mixed with confusion. "Why are you doing this?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible. Michael didn't have a clear answer, not one that made sense. "Sometimes we hold on to things for too long," he said softly. "Maybe it's time for me to let go." Lucas nodded, still visibly unsure, but too moved to argue further. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Michael replied, his own voice trembling. "Just take care of it." As Lucas closed the box and carefully placed it in his own jacket pocket, Michael felt a surge of mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also an unexpected surge of heartache. The watch, which had once connected him to Elena, was now in the hands of a stranger. He had hoped that giving it away would bring him peace, but instead it left a hollow ache in his chest. As Lucas left the store, disappearing into the chilly evening, Michael stood there, feeling untethered. He had expected closure, a sense of finality. Instead, he felt as though he had given away a piece of himself, a part of his past that he wasn't ready to relinquish. Walking back to his car, Michael wondered if he had made a mistake. The empty space in his pocket felt vast, a constant reminder of what he had just done. He had given the watch away, but the memories, the pain, they lingered. Little did Michael know, the act of donating that pocket watch would not only alter Lucas's life, but would one day return to change his own in ways he could never have imagined. The seasons passed, one blending into the next, as Michael's life continued its slow, monotonous march. Without Elena's watch in his possession, he had expected to feel lighter, free from the weight of its memories. But instead, the emptiness had only deepened. The gesture of giving it away, which he had hoped would bring some closure, had done the opposite. Now he felt more adrift than ever, as if that small act of kindness had severed his last tangible connection to the life he once knew. In the years following the encounter with Lucas, Michael's life remained largely the same. He busied himself with the mundane, housework, grocery runs, the occasional coffee with old colleagues, trying to fill the void left not only by Elena, but by the watch as well. The routine was familiar, and in a strange way, comforting. He was surviving, but not truly living. Then, one cold autumn afternoon, everything changed. Michael had been out on one of his usual evening walks when it happened. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town, and the crisp air filled his lungs as he made his way down the quiet streets. He remembered feeling lightheaded, a sudden dizziness that made his vision blur. He staggered, grabbing a nearby tree for support, his breath quickening. His heart felt like it was racing, then faltering, an erratic rhythm that sent a bolt of fear through him. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, darkness crept in around the edges of his vision, and the world fell away. The next thing Michael knew, he was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his nose and the soft beeping of a heart monitor echoing in his ears. His body felt weak, every breath a conscious effort. As he blinked against the harsh overhead lights, he realized he wasn't alone. A woman stood by his bedside, her expression kind but serious, her long brown hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She was wearing a white coat, her stethoscope slung casually around her neck. "You gave us quite a scare, Mr. Roberts," she said softly, a warm smile touching her lips. "How are you feeling?" Michael tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice came out as a rasp. "What happened?" "You had a heart attack," she explained, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "We managed to stabilize you, but it was close. You're lucky someone found you when they did." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of her words sink in. A heart attack. The idea felt surreal, distant, as though it had happened to someone else, not to him. He had always been relatively healthy, his life a steady, if lonely, routine. Yet, in an instant, everything had changed. "I'm Dr. Emily Evans," the woman continued, her tone gentle. "I've been overseeing your care since you were brought in." Michael nodded faintly, grateful but overwhelmed by the situation. He hadn't expected his life to take such a sharp turn, hadn't thought much about his own mortality despite the years creeping up on him. And now here he was, lying in a hospital bed, his life hanging by a thread. For the next few days, Michael remained in the hospital, his body recovering from the shock of the heart attack. He was in and out of sleep, the hours blending together as nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his medications. Dr. Evans visited him regularly, always with the same calm, reassuring presence. One afternoon, as Michael sat propped up in bed, feeling slightly stronger, Dr. Evans entered his room again. This time, she was carrying something in her hand, something small and familiar. "I wanted to ask you about this," she said, her brow furrowed slightly as she held up the object. "Does this look familiar to you?" Michael's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the item she was holding. It was Elena's pocket watch. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Michael's mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. He had given that watch away, years ago, to a stranger he had met in a grocery store. How was it here now in the hands of this doctor who had just saved his life? That's mine," Michael whispered, his voice trembling. "But how? How do you have it?" Dr. Evans smiled faintly, a sad but knowing look in her eyes. "It's a long story," she said, pulling up the chair again to sit beside him. "This watch, it belonged to my brother, Lucas." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Lucas, the young man from the grocery store, the one he had given the watch to all those years ago. He had never seen or heard from him again after that day, and he had assumed Lucas had moved on, perhaps even forgotten about the encounter entirely. But now, sitting here in this hospital room, Michael realized that the story was far from over. "Dr. Evans's eyes softened as she continued. "Lucas passed away a few years ago," she said quietly. "He struggled for a long time, and in the end, well, he didn't make it." Michael's chest tightened, not just from the lingering effects of the heart attack but from the weight of her words. Lucas was gone. The young man he had tried to help, the one he had seen so much of himself in, was gone. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know." Dr. Evans nodded, her expression understanding. "It's all right. I wanted to tell you, though, before he died, Lucas gave this watch to me. He told me that it was the most important thing anyone had ever given him. He said it helped him hold on, even in the darkest moments. Michael stared at the watch in her hands, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. He had never imagined that his small act of kindness would have such a profound impact on Lucas. He had given the watch away thinking it might help, but he had never known just how much it had meant to the young man. Dr. Evans's voice broke through his thoughts. After Lucas passed, I kept the watch with me. It was a reminder of him, of the struggles he went through, and the small things that kept him going. I used to look at it when I was in medical school, when things got hard, and it reminded me why I was doing this, to help people like my brother, people who needed someone to believe in them. Michael's eyes filled with tears as he listened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The watch, Elena's watch, had not only helped Lucas, but it also played a role in Dr. Evans's journey to becoming a doctor. And now, in an incredible twist of fate, she had been the one to save his life. After I graduated, Dr. Evans continued, her voice soft, I decided to sell some of Lucas's things to help pay off my medical school debt. This watch was one of the items I sold. I never expected to see it again, but when you came in, I noticed it among your personal effects. It felt like the universe was bringing it back to me. Michael couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The watch had come full circle, returning to him in the most unexpected way. It had played a role in saving his life, first by helping Dr. Evans become the doctor she was today, and now by bringing her to his side when he needed her most. Dr. Evans placed the watch gently in Michael's hand, her fingers brushing against his. I think this belongs to you now, she said softly. It's been on a long journey, but I believe it was always meant to come back to you. Michael's hand closed around the watch, the familiar weight of it settling into his palm. He stared at it through tear-filled eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of it all. Elena's gift, which he had thought he had lost forever, had not only returned to him, but had, in its own way, saved his life. In that moment, Michael realized something he had been struggling to accept for years. Elena was still with him, not just in memories or in the objects she had left behind, but in the very fabric of his life. Her love had never truly left him. It had found its way back to him, even when he had tried to let it go. The days following Michael's recovery were marked by a sense of disbelief. His body had begun to heal, but his mind was in turmoil. The heart attack had shaken him to his core, a stark reminder of his mortality. But it was the return of Elena's watch that weighed on him most heavily, stirring emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He sat in his hospital room, the soft murmur of medical equipment surrounding him, the watch cradled in his palm. He couldn't take his eyes off it. How was it possible that this small object, something he had given away in an attempt to move on, had found its way back to him at the most critical moment in his life? The logical part of him tried to dismiss it as coincidence, a series of unlikely but explainable events. But in his heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than mere chance. The watch had been a gift from Elena, given with love and intention, and now, somehow, it had played a role in saving him, just as she had always been his savior in life. He wasn't a man who easily believed in fate, but how else could he explain the full-circle nature of what had just occurred? Every night, as the hospital grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Michael lay awake, the watch clutched in his hand. His thoughts swirled with conflicting emotions, relief, confusion, guilt. He had let go of the watch, believing it was the right thing to do, yet here it was again, almost as if Elena had never intended for him to part with it in the first place. Had it been a mistake to give it away? He had thought he was releasing his grief by passing it on, but instead, it seemed that grief had found him again, wrapped in a new layer of complexity. The act of donating the watch had led to its journey through Lucas's life and ultimately to Emily, but now that it had returned, what was he supposed to do with it? Was it truly his again? Or did it belong to someone else now? Someone like Lucas, who had drawn strength from it? The questions gnawed at him, and with them came a deeper reflection on the concept of fate. Was this all part of some larger design? He had never been a spiritual man, and Elena had never pushed him to be. But she had believed in the subtle signs that life offered, in the quiet ways the universe guided people toward their destinies. Michael had never shared that belief, but now, sitting alone in his hospital bed, he wondered if Alina had been right all along. The thought of her filled him with a bittersweet ache. He had tried so hard to let go of her memory, to move beyond the pain of her absence, but perhaps he had misunderstood what letting go truly meant. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting or severing ties with the past, but about embracing the ways the past could shape and guide the future. Elena had always been the one who believed in the power of love to transcend time and space. She had often said that love was the thread that connected everything: past, present, and future. At the time, Michael had thought it was just another one of her romantic notions, something she would say to comfort him when he felt the weight of the world pressing down. But now, he could see the truth in her words. The watch, after all, was a symbol of that thread, linking him not only to Elena, but also to Lucas, to Emily, and to the countless ways their lives had intersected. It had passed through hands that needed it, offering solace and strength in ways Michael hadn't anticipated. And now, in a twist of fate, it had returned to him, not as a reminder of loss, but as a testament to the enduring power of connection. As he reflected on these thoughts, Michael felt a slow shift within him. The weight of the watch no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift once again. The grief that had once consumed him now felt softer, more distant. It wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something he could live with, something that no longer held him prisoner. That night, Michael dreamed of Elena for the first time in years. In the dream, she was standing in their old kitchen, the sunlight streaming in through the windows, her smile as radiant as ever. She was holding the pocket watch, her fingers brushing over its surface with the same tenderness she had always shown. When she saw him, her eyes lit up, and she held the watch out to him, just as she had all those years ago. "For you," she whispered in the dream, her voice soft and full of love. "It was always for you." When Michael woke the next morning, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The dream lingered in his mind, as vivid and real as if it had truly happened. He knew now, deep in his heart, that the watch had never been about holding on to the past in a way that trapped him. It had been about carrying the love and memories forward, allowing them to shape his future in ways he couldn't yet see. As the days passed and Michael prepared to leave the hospital, he found himself thinking more and more about the meaning of the watch's return. It wasn't just a fluke, an odd coincidence. It was a message, a reminder that love, once given, never truly left. Elena's love had found a way to remain in his life, guiding him through his darkest moments, even after her physical presence had been taken from him. He realized that he had been looking at life all wrong. He had believed that moving on from grief meant letting go, severing ties with the past in order to move forward. But maybe the real path to healing wasn't about letting go at all. Maybe it was about holding on to the things that mattered, the things that brought life meaning, and allowing them to evolve with you. Elena's watch was no longer a symbol of his grief. It was a symbol of his journey, of how far he had come, of the lives he had touched, and of the love that had never truly left him. It was a gift, not just from Elena, but from the universe itself, reminding him that life was full of unexpected connections, twists of fate, and second chances. For the first time in years, Michael felt something stir inside him, a spark of hope, of possibility. He had spent so long living in the shadow of his loss, but now he could see that there was more to life than grief. There were still things worth living for, still people worth connecting with, still love to be given and received. The experience with Lucas and Emily had shown him that even the smallest gestures of kindness could ripple out into the world in ways he couldn't predict. The watch had touched Lucas's life, and through him, it had found its way to Emily, helping her on her path to becoming a doctor. And now, in a strange and beautiful twist, it had come back to him, not to remind him of what he had lost, but to show him what he still had. Michael knew that he couldn't change the past. Elena was gone, and nothing could bring her back. But he could choose how to live with her memory, how to honor the love they had shared. He could choose to carry that love forward, to let it shape the rest of his life in ways that brought him closer to the people around him, instead of isolating him in his grief. As he held the watch in his hand, its familiar weight resting in his palm, Michael felt a quiet sense of resolution settle over him. He had spent so long feeling lost, but now he knew that he wasn't alone. Elena's love was still with him, and it always would be. The watch had returned to him, not by chance, but because it was meant to remind him of that simple, undeniable truth. Michael left the hospital a week later, the cool autumn air greeting him as he stepped out into the world again. The leaves had turned, vibrant oranges and reds scattered across the streets, a stark contrast to the sterile white walls he had been surrounded by for days. There was a new lightness in his step. Not because his body was fully healed, he still felt the fatigue of recovery, but because his spirit had found a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The pocket watch rested in his jacket pocket, its weight now familiar and comforting, not the burden it had once felt like. It wasn't just a keepsake of Elena anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger. As he walked down the sidewalk, he found himself thinking about the people in his life, those he had shut out in his grief, and what it might mean to open himself up to them again. His thoughts lingered on Sarah, his daughter. The distance between them had grown over the years, not out of anger or resentment, but out of a mutual retreat into their separate worlds of pain. When Elena had died, Sarah had been just as devastated as he was, perhaps more so in her own way. But instead of turning to each other for comfort, they had drifted apart. Sarah had tried in the beginning, reaching out with calls, emails, and invitations to visit. Michael had always responded politely, but never with the warmth or enthusiasm she had hoped for. Eventually, her calls became less frequent, her visits more rare, until they were practically strangers, separated by grief and miles of emotional distance. Michael had justified it to himself by believing that his solitude was what he needed to heal. But now he wondered if that had been a mistake. Had he pushed her away because he couldn't bear to face the shared pain they both carried? Had he been so focused on his own loss that he had failed to see her suffering as well? As he made his way home, the weight of these questions pressed down on him. But for the first time, he didn't shy away from them. Instead, he let them settle, acknowledging that perhaps it wasn't too late to make things right. That night, Michael sat in his quiet living room, the pocket watch resting on the table in front of him. The soft ticking filled the room, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. He had thought for so long that time had only brought him further from Elena, but now he understood that time had also given him the chance to heal, to learn, and to reconnect. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through the contacts until he found Sarah's name. It had been months since they had last spoken, and a year since he had seen her in person. His heart pounded in his chest as he hesitated, wondering if she would even want to hear from him after so long. But he knew that this was the first step he needed to take. Reaching out, breaking the silence that had defined their relationship for too long. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and just as Michael was about to hang up, he heard Sarah's voice on the other end. "Dad," she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and caution. "Is everything okay?" Michael swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "Hi, Sarah," he said softly. I'm okay. I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Michael worried that she might be too hurt or too distant to respond. But then her voice softened. "It's good to hear from you, Dad," she said. "It's been a while." Michael nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know. I'm sorry for that. I've been thinking a lot lately. About you, about Mom, about everything. And I realize that I've been pushing you away, and I'm sorry." The words came out haltingly, each one carrying the weight of years of regret and unspoken emotion. He had never been good at expressing his feelings, especially not to Sarah. But now he understood how much those words needed to be said. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Michael could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as she processed what he was saying. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle, but with an edge of vulnerability. "I've missed you, Dad. I know you've been hurting, and I didn't want to push, but I've missed you." Michael closed his eyes, his heart aching at the sincerity in her voice. "I've missed you too," he whispered. "More than I can say." There was a long pause, the silence between them filled with years of unsaid things. And then, finally, Sarah spoke again. "Maybe we could get together sometime? I'd love to catch up." The suggestion filled Michael with a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady. "I'd really like that." As they talked for a while longer, making tentative plans for a visit in the coming weeks, Michael felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. Reaching out to Sarah was just the beginning, but it was a start. It was a step toward healing the rift that had grown between them, a step toward living again, not just existing in the shadow of his grief. In the days that followed, Michael found himself thinking more about how he could make a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. The encounter with Lucas and the return of the watch had shown him how powerful a small act of kindness could be, how even the simplest gesture could ripple out and touch lives in ways he could never have imagined. One morning, as he sat on his porch, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the breeze, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He had spent so long living in isolation, focused only on his own pain, but now he felt a pull to reconnect with the world, to give back in some small way. The hospital where Dr. Evans had saved his life came to mind. He remembered the nurses, the doctors, the volunteers who had been there, offering care and comfort in his darkest moments. What if he could be a part of that? What if he could offer his time, his experience, and maybe even a little bit of the wisdom he had gained through his own journey? That afternoon, Michael called the hospital and inquired about volunteering. The coordinator he spoke to was kind and enthusiastic, explaining the different opportunities available, from helping patients navigate the hospital to sitting with those who had no family to keep them company. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something, and Michael felt a quiet sense of purpose begin to take root within him. A few weeks later, Michael found himself back at the hospital, this time not as a patient, but as a volunteer. He was nervous at first, unsure of how he would fit into this new role, but as the days passed, he began to find comfort in the routine. He sat with patients who were alone, listened to their stories, and offered a kind word or a gentle smile. In those moments, he realized that giving didn't always mean grand gestures. Sometimes it was simply being present, offering your time and attention to someone who needed it. One day, as he sat beside an elderly woman who had just undergone surgery, holding her hand as she rested, Michael felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The pocket watch was in his jacket pocket, its ticking a constant reminder of the journey that had brought him here. Elena's love, Lucas's struggle, Emily's kindness, it had all led him to this moment, a moment where he could give back, where he could offer the same compassion that had once saved him. Michael smiled softly to himself, knowing that he had found his way back to life, not by letting go of the past, but by carrying it forward with him. The watch was no longer just a relic of what he had lost. It was a symbol of the connections that had shaped his life and the love that continued to guide him. He had reconciled with his past, with the pain and the memories, and in doing so, he had opened himself up to a new beginning, one filled with hope, purpose, and the quiet joy of making a difference in the lives of others. Weeks passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm for Michael. His mornings were spent at the hospital, where he volunteered, and his afternoons were often filled with quiet conversations with Sarah, reconnecting in ways he hadn't thought possible after so much time. Slowly, they began to rebuild their relationship, piece by piece, sharing memories of Elena and creating new ones that were filled with laughter rather than the weight of sorrow. Michael no longer felt the deep, unrelenting emptiness that had shadowed his every step since Elena's death. He wasn't healed, not entirely. The grief was still there, a part of him that would never fully disappear. But it had changed. It had softened, becoming a part of his life rather than the thing that defined it. Through his work at the hospital, Michael had learned something that he wished he had understood sooner. That connection, in whatever form it takes, is what gives life meaning. The simple act of being present for others, of offering a hand to hold or an ear to listen, was enough to remind him that he still had a place in the world. He had spent so many years closed off, believing that his grief was something he had to carry alone. But now he saw that sharing that weight with others, whether through volunteering, reconnecting with Sarah, or even just speaking Elena's name aloud, was part of what had allowed him to move forward. One afternoon, as Michael was wrapping up his shift at the hospital, he ran into Dr. Emily Evans again. She was walking down the hallway, her pace brisk and purposeful, but when she saw him, her face lit up with a warm smile. "Michael," she said, slowing to greet him. "I've been meaning to thank you for all the time you've been putting in here. I've heard nothing but good things from the staff and patients." Michael smiled back, feeling a small sense of pride. "It's been good for me," he admitted. "I wasn't sure if I'd fit in at first, but it's given me something to look forward to." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "It's funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? How small acts can lead to unexpected connections." Her words struck Michael deeply, reminding him of the long, winding journey that had brought them together in the first place. The watch, Lucas. The heart attack that had nearly taken his life, but had instead brought him back to the world in ways he never could have imagined. As they spoke, Michael found himself reaching into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the familiar shape of the pocket watch. He pulled it out and looked down at it, the smooth silver surface catching the light. It was still as beautiful as ever, the ticking inside steady and constant, like a heartbeat. Emily's gaze followed his movement, and when she saw the watch, her smile grew wistful. "I'm glad you have it back," she said softly. "I know it meant a lot to my brother." Michael nodded, his thoughts drifting back to Lucas, the young man he had tried to help so long ago. The watch had connected them in ways neither of them could have anticipated, and now, holding it in his hand, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude for the way things had unfolded. But as he looked at the watch, another thought began to form in his mind, one that had been lingering at the edges of his consciousness for days now. The watch had been on a journey, just as he had, and in its own way, it had fulfilled its purpose. It had connected people, brought comfort in times of need, and had come full circle to save his life. But now, perhaps, it was time for it to continue its journey. Later that evening, Michael sat at his kitchen table, the watch in front of him. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. The walls, once heavy with the echoes of a life that had ended, now seemed to hum with the possibility of new beginnings. His phone buzzed with a new message from Sarah. She had sent a picture of her and her young daughter, smiling at a park, their faces bright with laughter. Michael smiled as he looked at the photo, feeling the warmth of connection in his chest. Life, he realized, was still moving forward, and so was he. The watch, though precious to him, was no longer something he needed to hold on to. Its significance had shifted, and now he felt that it was time to pass it on, just as Elena had given it to him, and as he had once given it to Lucas. It wasn't meant to stay with one person forever. It was meant to be shared, to continue its journey. The next day, Michael returned to the hospital, the watch nestled in a small box in his jacket pocket. He wasn't entirely sure who he would give it to, but he trusted that the moment would come. And sure enough, as he walked down the hallway, he noticed a young woman sitting alone in the waiting area, her face drawn with worry. She was clutching her phone, her fingers tapping nervously against the screen, and every so often she would glance toward the door, as though waiting for someone to come through with news she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Michael felt a familiar tug in his chest, the same feeling he'd had all those years ago when he had first met Lucas. He didn't know this young woman, didn't know her story or what she was going through, but something inside him told him that she was the one. She was the next step in the watch's journey. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me," he said gently, and she looked up, her eyes wide and filled with unshed tears. "Are you all right?" The young woman shook her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My dad," she whispered. "He's in surgery. They don't know if he's going to make it." Michael's heart clenched. He knew that fear, that helplessness. He had felt it himself, lying in a hospital bed after his heart attack, wondering if he would make it through. He sat down beside her, offering her the kind of quiet comfort that he had come to understand so well. After a few moments of silence, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the small box. "I don't know if this will help," he said softly, "but I'd like you to have this." The young woman looked at him, her brows furrowed in confusion, but she took the box with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, and when she saw the watch inside, her eyes widened in surprise. "It's a gift," Michael said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "It's been passed down through a lot of hands, and it's brought comfort to people when they needed it most. I think it's time for it to help someone else." The young woman blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked from the watch to Michael. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Michael replied, smiling softly. "Just take care of it, and when the time comes, maybe you'll pass it on to someone else who needs it." The young woman nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the watch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As Michael stood to leave, he felt lighter than he had in years. The watch, Alina's gift, had come full circle, just as it was meant to. It had saved him, but now it was time for it to save someone else. As he walked out of the hospital and into the crisp autumn air, Michael smiled to himself. He had finally made peace with his past, and in doing so he had found a way to move forward. The cycle of love, loss, and redemption would continue, just as it always had. And somewhere, he knew, Elena was smiling too.